So tonight is going to be about amateur radio and why it's not the dead hobby that you think it might be in the 2020s. Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for coming back. I really do hope some of you are returning subscribers. If you do like these videos, I know they're a bit crappy at the minute. We're still getting used to everything. I've been saying this for 12 months and I'm still crap at doing this. If you do like them, like and subscribe. I got it right, see the right side? Oh, we're learning. And hopefully that'll start to help us out and we can start to invest more in the channel. Anything we make from this, at least for the time being, is going to be reinvested back into the kit and making everything a little bit better. When I was about 12, one of my friend's dads had a CB radio and I was enamoured by this thing because you have to remember, when I was that age, there was no mobile phones, or they were in their infancy. I mean, a mobile phone was a big brick thing with a battery and a handset. So I was enamoured with this thing. It was in his car and it used to crackle into life and he could talk to his friends and he knew a load of other people with CB radio, and we'd drive along going somewhere, probably to a football match, or on a Saturday morning, because we used to play little league football, soccer to the Americans, and this thing would crackle into life and I was just amazed by this thing. You could talk to your friends and it didn't cost anything and it was just stunning. Anyway, so a year or so goes past, everything evolved, mobile phones started to trickle out, and CB, basically a lot of people went, nah, don't want it anymore. So long story short, his dad remembered that I liked this thing and he sold it to me for £20, I think it was, and me and my dad set it up in my bedroom and I talked to everybody in the local area for months on this thing. Eventually, because we didn't really know what we were doing, so we knew nothing about matching the antenna to the radio, we just plugged it in as best we could and made it work. He used to use a little wall wart to power it. I mean, that's how bad, we just didn't understand these things. So eventually it broke, and by this point I understood a lot more about how radios worked. I'd kind of got into this hobby, and we went to Tandy and I spoke to a chap there and he said, no, what you really want to do is come away from CB, just go straight to amateur radio. You're old enough to do the licence, and off you go. And I looked into the licence and one of the options was Morse code, and at that particular point it wasn't going to happen. There was no way I could learn Morse code. I had tried in the past and failed, so I thought nothing more of it. I actually bought a European frequency CB radio from the shop, from Tandy, which is Radio Shack. Tandy was our version, same shop, same chain. And it was a realistic TRC 2005, which was a European frequency CB radio. Now that's important because the UK frequencies, you could only talk to other UK people, whereas the European ones, a lot of UK people had them, so you could still talk to other people locally, but 3 or 4 months a year when the sun came out, all of a sudden the conditions were right, because these things are on 27 to 28 megahertz in that frequency range. So you could suddenly start talking to Italy or France or Germany. And by the time I was 15, I had a wall full of what's called QSL cards. So when you have a conversation between a foreign country and your country, it's called a QSO. Well, any radio to radio conversation is a QSO. But when it's between you and a foreign country, it's still called a QSO, but you'd send a QSL card. So that basically is a postcard, and it would have a little bit of information on about you. It could be a picture of your radio equipment, it could be a picture of your house or your antennas or yourself, and you'd post this off to this foreign radio user, and they would do the return and they'd send one back. And I had a wall full from CB radio. Kind of the internet came along. I mean, this is now we're in the early 90s. The internet came along and girls came along and all radio stuff got put away, and never really looked back until I settled down and finally felt in a position in a relationship where I could actually say, I really want to have a crack at this and be fine with it. It sounds stupid. I can hear myself. It just sounds so stupid. Why didn't I just do it before? Anyway, long story. So I emailed the local radio group and said, I would like to do the foundation licence, please. And I did the foundation licence, passed it with top marks. Went back 6 months later, I bought a radio, a little handheld, which I'll put the footage in here. I'll explain more about these a little bit later on in the video. Went back 6 months later, did the intermediate course, passed that. Got asked to go back and teach the foundation and intermediate courses, which I did for 4 years. Long story about that. Don't teach it anymore. And I'm now no longer a member of that club either because of all the stuff that happened. But that's the topic for another video. So why would you still want to be involved in amateur radio in the year 2020? Well, I did it because I wanted to. I love radio. I've always wanted an amateur radio licence. Didn't think any more about it. It's just something I want to do. But I suddenly realised when I was teaching the course, we used to get all sorts of people coming through, and one thing we'd ask them is, why do you want to have an amateur radio licence? And it suddenly dawned on me, with amateur radio, it's not just person-to-person contact. Amateur radio has been at the forefront of most breakthroughs with radio technology. So if you think about going right back, Morse code was probably one of the first radio communication types. Fax was a derivative from an amateur radio protocol. Radio teletype, going back before fax, it's still used on radio. That was invented by a radio amateur. We've got satellite communications. I mean, this is the stuff that you can now do. So, I mean, all these little things that have led on from it. So, satellite communications, you've got HF communications for long distance communication. You've got space comms for deep space stuff. So, if you want to listen to Voyager, you can do that with a decent antenna. I mean, a big, decent antenna. But there are people in America that do that. There's something called EME, or Earth, Moon, Earth, where you actually you have a conversation with someone by pointing your antennas at the moon and bouncing off the moon's surface back to Earth. So you'll have a conversation across the planet via this long path. Sporadic E, where you use this exactly the same thing, but you use meteorites as they burn up through the atmosphere. You can have a brief conversation on the ionising gas, bouncing your signal off the ionising gas behind. There are people that use aircraft to do it. They'll actually bounce their signal off a passing aircraft. It's a big metal reflector in the sky. Why not? But it also teaches you about how the nuts and bolts of radio actually work. So if you want to get involved in things like wireless networking, by doing an amateur radio licence, it will give you an excellent grounding in how that wireless device is actually talking to the other wireless device and what obstacles are in the way and what you need to do to make that signal work and all these other things. So I think amateur radio is still very relevant. People are still inventing new systems to use on amateur radio. There's two really big things that have come out recently which have taken amateur radio by storm and really opened it up again. So the first one is something called FT8. Now that's a mode. It sounds like a squeaky wheelbarrow, like a lot of data modes do. But it will allow you to transmit from your radio a small signal. Takes 15 or 30 seconds depending on the mode. And somebody will receive that signal, and it could be anywhere on the planet. All happens automatically. And then you'll get a report back to say, I've received your signal, I'm in this country, I'm at this place. And you can plot out exactly where your radio's working, and you'll see it on the map. You'll see a nice ring where your radio's reaching to with the current skip conditions, or you might just see it down the coast of Europe, or you might just see it on the coast of America, or you might see it. It gives you an idea of how it's working, but you can exchange a very brief message automatically with somebody else, not just one person. You will see when you put FT8 on, you will get hundreds of responses in some cases when the conditions are right. So the other thing that's come along recently, and it's just been a massive thing for amateur radio, was the Raspberry Pi. Because somebody brought out a little module. So you've got your Raspberry Pi, which is a single board computer. I don't have one to hand. And you plug in a little radio module, which you can buy very cheaply. I mean, this whole thing, I bought mine for $60. So this Raspberry Pi has a radio module on that talks to your radio. It then also talks to your wireless network and connects to other little Raspberry Pi devices, so I can talk on my radio from here, using radio to the Raspberry Pi through the internet to somebody else's Raspberry Pi or a repeater that's connected, and out to a load of other people, possibly, well, in any country in the world. I can talk to Italy, I can talk to France, Germany, US, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, China. So all of a sudden you can talk to people all over the world. If you know another amateur radio person, or if you and your partner have amateur radio, they can take a Pi Star with them, plug it in, whatever country they happen to be in, and talk on a radio back to you via the internet. I know we can do this with phones, it's just not as fun, is it? We like to have a bit of fun with these things. Once you get to the intermediate stage of amateur radio, you can actually start to build your own equipment. So if you want to get involved in wireless projects and designing your own circuitry and perhaps designing a little communication system, you can do that. And all of a sudden, with your amateur radio license, you've got access to the radio spectrum. Okay, it's all in little chunks here and there, but you've got access from a few kilohertz right up into the gigahertz. The other thing that people don't realise is that on the International Space Station, there are two amateur radios installed on the space station. Every astronaut that goes to the International Space Station, whether they're Russian, British, American, French, German, Swedish, whatever nationality they are, they're granted an amateur radio license for the duration of their flight. In fact, I think they do the full exam. Tim Peake, when he was in space, actually did a broadcast that was sent via amateur radio to a school, and it was in Essex, the school. But just about every amateur I know listened in on that frequency to hear Tim Peake talking directly from the International Space Station. So, let's talk about equipment. What does it cost to get involved in amateur radio? Well, pretty much your license is free. There are a couple of exam fees to pay. And at the intermediate stage, you will also need to buy a kit, because as part of the intermediate, you actually have to build a little radio project. It's not expensive, 20 quid I think ours was. 25 quid covered everything that you need. The exam fees, I believe, I'm out of touch because I haven't trained for 4 years, but when I left it was about 20 or 30 quid for the exam fees, including the hall hire. This little Baofeng radio, I've seen it retailing for less than £20 on eBay and Amazon. It's a decent start into amateur radio. It supports two of the bands in the mid and high frequencies. I call it mid and high. It's actually VHF and UHF, which will give you access to local repeaters. So a repeater is a big tower somewhere or a high building, and on top there's a radio that listens on one frequency and retransmits on another, so you get a much wider field of use. So if I transmit from my little Baofeng, my 18 quid Baofeng handheld from Toaster to our local repeater, the local repeater then retransmits out, and I can talk to people from Cambridge down to Luton, all the way through Northamptonshire and slightly beyond. I've actually used my handheld from Rutland, which is about 50 miles from the repeater. What you find in amateur radio is that people, it tends to be the first radio that they ever use. They kind of get used to the menu system on there, and then they kind of stick with that all the way through their amateur radio career. And for me, I actually bought a Yaesu radio when I was about 17 or 18 just to listen into the bands, and I kind of got used to it, and so now I'm predominantly, if I'm going to pick up anything, it's going to be a Yaesu radio. It's just the way I am. So if we start off, let's start off with a small handheld, and I'll take you through the range. I don't go up to the top of the range, believe it or not, and but we'll go through the Yaesu range, and I'll show you what I've got at the moment and what we've got. So the first radio is this one, which is the FT2D. So this is a handheld radio. It does exactly the same as the Baofeng with a few more bells and whistles. So the Baofeng will do everything that this does, apart from this one has GPS enabled built in, and it has a Yaesu System Fusion, which is a digital mode that again uses the repeaters, so I can talk in a digital format, which also transmits my position information at the same time. So if I talk to somebody, it will show me on the screen. If they've got the System Fusion enabled with the GPS, it will show me on the screen how far and in which direction they are. So I know straight away, okay, they're 40 miles that way and they're northeast from me. Easy. Stepping up, the next one we've got here is a Yaesu 7800, 78, 79. I'm not sure, I'll have to look at it. I think it's a 78. Which is, again, it's exactly the same as the handheld. The only difference is that this one has to be plugged into a decent power supply, like a 12 volt battery, car battery, effectively. That's what it's designed for. And it has a bit more power output. So this one here outputs 50 watts. The handhelds put out a maximum of 5 watts. This one puts out 50 watts, which means I've got a little bit more power. I can talk just a little bit further. Believe it or not, a 10-fold increase in power in real world terms only gives you an extra mile, maybe an extra mile and a half. It's a very, very small gain. The best gain you're ever going to get is to improve your antenna. The FT450D, so this radio is a little bit different. This is the FT450D. This radio operates from kilohertz up to about 50 megahertz. It's what's called an HF radio. Now this one is much more for long distance communication. So with HF, at certain frequencies, the ionosphere around the planet becomes a radio reflector. So you can bounce a signal off the ionosphere and back down to Earth. And that means that you can transmit up to the ionosphere, and it'll bounce down, and it might land in Germany, it might land in Italy, it could land in America or Australia. And it just gives you that option. So if I want to talk locally, I'll pick up one of the handhelds or the little one and talk on a higher frequency, so 400 megahertz. Likewise, if I want to talk through the ionosphere to the International Space Station, I'll use a higher frequency, UHF. And if I want to talk around the world and I want to talk to Germany, Italy, France, or somewhere a bit further afield, I'll use HF because that gives me the best option to get back down. Stepping up, this is the best radio I've ever owned. It's the FT991A from Yaesu. No surprise there with me and Yaesu. This particular radio is a little bit special because it's the first radio I've bought that is all of the other radios combined. So this one is an HF radio. I can use it from kilohertz to 50 megahertz, but I can also use it on VHF, so 140-ish megahertz, and UHF 400 megahertz. It also does the Yaesu System Fusion, so it's literally everything in one box. It means I only have to have one power supply, 2 antennas, because there's 2 antenna connectors on it, one for HF, one for VHF. But I can do everything, all on one radio, from one interface, one computer connection, and I can go anywhere I want and talk to anybody I want. Anyway guys, if there is anything about amateur radio you want to see, if it's FT8 or if it's Pi-Stars and internet communications, if it's HF, VHF, UHF repeaters, just drop me a message in the comments below and we'll see what we can do, see if we can set up a demonstration and how it works and show you. Anyway guys, it's been a bit of waffle tonight, but there you go. If you have liked it, like, share and subscribe. Like, subscribe and share. And if there's anything you want to say, like I say, just stick it in the comments and we'll see how we go. Thanks for watching guys. Catch you next time.